I watched Jake Mitchell's car get towed from the shoulder of Route 9, its back end sagging where it had drifted into the drainage ditch. 3 days sitting out there, and now it was just more evidence in a case that would never be solved. The tow truck operator hooked the chains under the front bumper, not asking questions. He'd done this before. The kid should have followed the rules. That's all I kept thinking as the car lifted onto the flatbed. Simple rules that kept Millbrook residents alive. But the Mitchells hadn't listened. I remembered when they first came to my hardware store about 2 months back. The whole family walked in like people do when they're starting fresh in a small town. Excited, a little nervous, looking around at everything like it was quaint. David Mitchell had approached the counter with a list of supplies they needed for the old Henderson place. "Just moved in yesterday," he'd said while I rang up their items. "Bigger project than we expected, but the price was right." "The Henderson house has been empty a while," I'd said, bagging their purchases. "Town council give you the welcome packet?" Sarah Mitchell had laughed then. "Oh yes, that strange little pamphlet with the rules. My husband thinks it's adorable." David had pulled out the folded paper from his back pocket, the same packet we give to all newcomers. 6 rules printed in bold letters with the town seal at the top. "Never pick up hitchhikers on Route 9, he'd read aloud with a smirk. "Don't enter the old cemetery after dark. Keep windows closed at night." He'd chuckled, looking at me to share in his amusement. "Small towns and their folklore, right? What's next? No swimming during the full moon?" I hadn't smiled back. "Those rules keep people safe around here." "Safe from what exactly?" David had asked, still wearing that smug look of a city person humoring the local yokel. "Just follow them," I'd said, handing over their receipt, especially with teenagers in the house. The Mitchells had thanked me for the supplies, but walked out laughing about small-town superstitions. Now their son was gone. I drove back to the sheriff's office, where the search teams were gathering for the morning briefing. The parking lot was full. Most of Millbrook had turned out to help. That's what we did when someone went missing, even though those of us who'd lived here our whole lives knew better. Inside, Sarah Mitchell was screaming at Sheriff Morrison again. I could hear her voice from the hallway. 3 days. 3 days and you haven't found anything. My son is out there somewhere." I stepped into the main office area. Sarah's face was red and streaked with tears, her hair unwashed and pulled back messily. David stood beside her, a hand on her shoulder, looking hollow-eyed and lost. Sheriff Morrison kept his voice calm and official. "Mrs. Mitchell, we have teams covering every section of the woods along Route 9. We're doing everything possible. Then call in state police, get search dogs, do something more than these amateur search parties." The sheriff caught my eye across the room. I'd known Morrison since we were kids. He'd been sheriff for 15 years, had seen this scenario play out before. "We've notified state authorities," he told her, "but it's our jurisdiction, and we know these woods better than anyone." What he didn't say was that outside help never made a difference. The things that took people in Millbrook didn't leave evidence for police dogs to track. Deputy Reynolds was at a side table, organizing maps and volunteer assignments. I walked over, wanting to keep busy rather than watch Sarah's pain. I'd already seen too much of that in this town. "Morning, Thomas," Reynolds said, handing me a clipboard. "You're with Team 3 today, checking the north section past Creekside Road." I nodded, taking the map. "Any developments overnight?" Reynolds shook his head slightly. "Nothing." He lowered his voice. "Kid picked up a hitchhiker on Route 9. We all know how this ends." "The families knew," I said. "They didn't believe the rules." "They believe now," he replied, glancing toward the Mitchells. Sarah had collapsed into a chair, sobbing into her hands while David paced in small circles beside her. Their daughter Emma, a teenager maybe 15 or 16, sat nearby staring blankly at the wall. I joined my search team as we headed out in Reynolds' truck. 4 of us today, me, Bill Jenkins from the post office, Karen Whitley who taught at the elementary school, and Mark Sanderson, who ran the gas station. All of us born in Millbrook. All of us had seen people disappear before. Kid really pick up one of them on the highway? Mark asked as we bumped down the access road into the northern woods. I nodded. That's what his friend said. Driving home from basketball practice in Riverside. Stopped for someone on the roadside. Damn shame, Karen said. Why don't these newcomers ever listen? We spent 8 hours searching our assigned grid, calling Jake's name, looking for broken branches, pieces of clothing, any sign of struggle or passage. We found nothing, just like I knew we would. The woods in Millbrook could swallow people whole, leaving nothing behind. The hitchhikers on Route 9 weren't human. They looked human enough when they stood with their thumbs out, wearing ordinary clothes, smiling ordinary smiles. But anyone who stopped for them vanished, and the car would later be found abandoned on the roadside. That was the first rule. Never pick up hitchhikers on Route 9. The simplest one to follow, you'd think. By nightfall, we returned to the sheriff's office empty-handed. The Mitchells were still there, now surrounded by neighbors bringing food and coffee. The community did what it could, even when the outcome was certain. Sarah looked up as our team entered, hope flaring in her eyes for just a second before she saw our expressions. Nothing? David asked, his voice hoarse. I shook my head. We'll go out again tomorrow. He nodded, then looked away. The condescending smirk was gone now. His face had the beginning look I'd seen on others who'd lost someone to Millbrook's secrets, a stunned realization that the world wasn't what they thought it was. Jake's a smart kid, he said. Maybe he got lost hiking or is staying with friends and forgot to call. We all let him have that fiction. No one said what we knew. Jake was gone because he'd broken the first rule. The hitchhikers took him wherever they took all their victims. The search continued for 2 more days. More volunteers, more grid patterns, more shouting into empty woods. We found Jake's phone in a ditch, about half a mile from where his car had been abandoned. The screen was cracked, the battery dead. Nothing else. On the 3rd day, when we returned to the sheriff's office, Sarah was quieter. She sat with Emma, arms around her daughter, both of them red-eyed, but no longer crying. The frantic energy had drained out of her, replaced by something worse: acceptance. David approached me as I was hanging up my jacket. You knew, didn't you? He asked. When you told us to follow the rules, you knew they were real. I looked at him for a long moment. Everyone in Millbrook knows. Why didn't you make us understand? Why didn't someone explain? Would you have believed me if I'd told you there are things in this town that take people? That the rules aren't folklore? They're survival? He didn't answer, just ran a hand through his unwashed hair. We have to keep looking, he finally said. He's my son. We will, I promised, knowing it wouldn't make any difference. That night I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee gone cold, looking down the street toward the Henderson house where the Mitchells had settled so hopefully just weeks ago. Their lights were on, shadows moving behind curtains. They'd learned to keep those windows closed at night now. I thought about the other rules they'd need to follow if they stayed in Millbrook. Don't enter the old cemetery after dark. Don't acknowledge voices calling from the woods. Don't look directly at the figures that stand at the edge of your property. Don't follow the lights that appear on Porter's Lake. But I knew the Mitchells wouldn't need those rules much longer. Most families left after losing someone, packed up and moved away, telling themselves they were leaving because of the painful memories, not because they finally believed. I went inside and locked my door as night settled fully over Millbrook. Jake Mitchell was gone, and no amount of searching would bring him back. That was the harsh truth of our town. Break the rules, and you disappear. The rules were the only protection we had, passed down through generations. I wondered if the Mitchells would stay long enough to learn that lesson completely, or if they'd run like so many others before them. Either way, the rules would remain, keeping the rest of us alive in a town where something hungry was always waiting for someone to make a mistake. I pulled up to the Mitchell house just as the chaos erupted. Red and blue lights from Sheriff Morrison's cruiser swept across the front yard, where David Mitchell stood shouting his daughter's name into the darkness. His voice cracked with desperation as he ran toward the tree line at the edge of their property. "Emma, stop! Come back!" I jumped out of my truck and ran after him. The night air felt wrong, colder than it should have been for early September, with that strange stillness that always made my skin crawl. Deputy Reynolds met me halfway across the yard. Emma took off into the woods, says she heard Jake calling her. My stomach dropped. The third rule: don't acknowledge voices calling from the woods. "How long ago?" I asked. "Just minutes." David tried to grab her, but she was too quick. More vehicles pulled up behind us. Bill Jenkins, Karen Whitley, and others from town who'd been searching for Jake these past days. Everyone knew what another search meant. Everyone knew what happened when someone broke the rules. Sarah Mitchell stood on the porch, frozen in place, her arms wrapped around herself as if she might fall apart otherwise. Her face was blank with shock. "She said she heard him," Sarah whispered when I approached. "She said Jake was calling her name from the trees." David came running back from the edge of the woods, panting and wild-eyed. "She's gone. I couldn't catch her." He looked at me with new understanding in his eyes. "She said she heard Jake's voice, clear as day." Sheriff Morrison organized us into teams quickly. This wasn't our first emergency search, and everyone knew time mattered, even if we also knew how this would likely end. "Thomas, you take east with David and Karen," Morrison said, handing out flashlights. "Bill, Mark, and I will take west. Reynolds, you and the others cover the north section. Radio check every 15 minutes. David clutched his flashlight with white knuckles. "What's happening? How could she hear Jake if—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "The woods play tricks at night," I said, leading him toward our search area. "That's why we have the rules." We pushed into the trees, calling Emma's name. Our flashlight beams cut through darkness that seemed to swallow the light too quickly. The woods behind the Mitchell property connected to the larger forest that surrounded most of Millbrook. During the day, these were normal woods, trees, underbrush, the occasional deer path. But at night, they changed. "Emma!" David's voice rang out, bouncing between the trees. "Emma, please come back." Karen stayed close to me, her eyes darting between shadows. She'd been born here too, knew what we were really facing. "I've never heard of two from the same family," she murmured to me as David moved ahead, crashing through brush. "Me neither," I admitted. "Not this close together." We'd been walking for 20 minutes when David stopped suddenly. "There!" He pointed his flashlight at something pale against the dark ground. Emma's white jacket lay crumpled near the base of a large oak tree. Next to it, her phone screen glowed with unread notifications. David rushed forward and grabbed both items. "Emma!" His voice broke as he spun in circles, the flashlight beam jerking wildly through the trees. "She wouldn't leave her phone. She's always on her phone." I took the jacket from him, checking the pockets. Empty. "We need to keep moving," I said, but something felt off about our direction. The trees looked wrong somehow, too close together, arranged in patterns that didn't make sense. Karen noticed it too. "Thomas," she said quietly, "aren't we heading north now? I thought we were supposed to go east." I checked my compass. The needle spun lazily, unable to find north. "Compasses don't work right out here at night," I told David, who was watching with growing horror. "We'll use the stars." But when I looked up, the tree canopy had thickened, blocking the sky completely. We continued anyway, pushing deeper into the woods. Or at least we thought we were going deeper. After another hour of walking, David stopped. "This isn't right," he said. "That's the same fallen log we passed earlier. We're going in circles." He was right. Despite walking in what felt like a straight line, we'd somehow looped back to where we'd found Emma's jacket. It lay on the ground again, though I was certain David had been carrying it. I'd lived in Millbrook my entire life, 32 years of following the rules, of knowing what lurked just beyond normal sight. But this was different. The woods had always been dangerous at night, but they'd never been this active, this aggressive in manipulating space. "Thomas," Karen whispered, pointing. 20 feet ahead, a figure stood between the trees, barely visible in the darkness, small like a teenage girl. "Emma!" David shouted, rushing forward before I could stop him. The figure turned and moved deeper into the woods, just a shadow slipping between trees. David chased after it, and Karen and I had no choice but to follow. "David, wait!" I called, but he was beyond listening, crashing through underbrush as he chased the fleeting shape. We ran for what felt like minutes, but could have been longer. Time worked strangely out here, too. Then David stopped so suddenly I nearly ran into him. "Where did she go?" he panted, spinning around. "She was right here." We stood in a small clearing I didn't recognize, though I'd hunted these woods since I was a boy. The trees around us seemed to lean inward, like they were listening. "We should regroup with the others," I said, reaching for my radio. But when I pressed the talk button, only static answered. For the next several hours, we searched in what I can only describe as a nightmare landscape. Paths that should have led to known landmarks instead circled back on themselves. Radio contact with the other teams cut in and out, their voices distorted and sometimes speaking words none of us had said. More disturbing were the voices that came from between the trees. Whispers that sounded like Emma, like Jake, like people who'd gone missing years ago. They always seemed to come from just out of sight, drawing us forward, then fading when we got close. David kept pushing ahead, his initial desperation hardening into something dangerous. "They're out here," he insisted. "Both of them." By the time our flashlights began to dim, we'd found ourselves back at the tree line where we'd started, as if the forest had simply decided to release us. The other search teams trickled out of the woods at different points, all with the same experience. Paths that led nowhere, voices that couldn't be tracked, and a sense of being watched by something that moved just beyond our vision. Sheriff Morrison called off the search as dawn broke, not because we'd given up hope, but because we all knew continuing was pointless. The woods had taken Emma just as surely as something had taken Jake from Route 9. David sat on the back steps of his house as the search teams dispersed, Emma's jacket clutched in his hands. Sarah had been sedated by the town doctor and was sleeping inside. I sat down beside him, not knowing what to say, but feeling I should say something. "You told us," David said before I could speak. "You warned us about the rules and we laughed." His voice was hollow, empty of everything but grief. "We thought they were just small-town superstitions. Most people do when they first move here," I said. "What are they? What took my children?" He looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "We don't know," I admitted. "Nobody does. They've always been here, whatever they are. The rules are just what we've figured out keeps us safe." David nodded slowly. "We're leaving. As soon as Sarah can travel. There's nothing for us here now." I understood. Most people left after losing someone to the town's secrets. It was easier than staying and being reminded every day of what lurked just out of sight. 3 days later, I watched a moving truck pull away from the Henderson house. Sarah didn't look back as David drove their car behind the truck. The house would sit empty again, waiting for the next family who didn't know or wouldn't believe. That night, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, looking down the street toward another empty house on Maple Street. The Mitchells had learned what everyone in Millbrook eventually learned. The rules weren't suggestions or superstitions. They were survival. I thought about Emma running into the woods, chasing a voice that sounded like her brother. I thought about Jake picking up a hitchhiker on Route 9. Simple rules broken, with permanent consequences. The streetlight at the end of Maple flickered, and for a moment I saw a figure standing beneath it, not quite right, not quite human in the way it stood. I looked away quickly and went inside. I'd lived in Millbrook long enough to follow the rules without thinking. They were as much a part of me as breathing. I locked my door and closed my curtains as night settled over the town. Emma and Jake Mitchell were gone, and the Mitchells had fled. It was a story I'd seen play out before, and one I'd see again. In Millbrook, the rules were all we had against the darkness that was always waiting for someone to make a mistake. I noticed the college students arriving in their rental car on a Tuesday morning. 4 of them piled out in front of Diane's diner, stretching after the long drive with the careless energy of youth. They looked exactly like what they were, kids playing at being filmmakers, all carrying expensive camera equipment and talking excitedly about capturing authentic small-town folklore. One of them, a tall guy with a beard and a NYU film school t-shirt, took panoramic footage of Main Street while his friends unloaded their bags. The town had been quiet since the Mitchells left 3 weeks ago. Their empty house sat waiting for the next family who wouldn't believe, while the rest of us went about our lives following the rules that kept us alive. The appearance of these students felt like a stone dropping into still water, a disruption we didn't need. I was restocking shelves at the hardware store when Diane came in for a box of light bulbs. "Got 4 staying upstairs," she said, counting out cash on the counter. "Film students doing some kind of documentary about small towns with strange local legends." "How'd they hear about us?" I asked, bagging her purchase. "Internet. Where else?" Said they found a forum where people talked about Millbrook's creepy rules. Thought it would make good content. She rolled her eyes. "They've already been asking customers all morning if they believe in the supernatural." I handed Diane her change. "Did you give them the welcome packet?" "Of course I did. Left one in each room. Not that they'll read it. Young people these days think rules don't apply to them." After closing the store, I walked over to the diner for coffee. 3 of the students sat at a corner booth surrounded by notebooks and a laptop. The 4th, a girl with purple-streaked hair, was interviewing Mrs. Bentley, who'd lived in Millbrook even longer than I had. "So you actually believe that hitchhikers on Route 9 aren't human?" Purple Hair was asking, holding a digital recorder. Mrs. Bentley's face tightened. "We follow the rules in Millbrook. That's all I'll say about it." The girl looked disappointed. "But what do you think they are? Ghosts? Aliens?" Mrs. Bentley gathered her purse and stood up. "You should read the welcome packet." I sat at the counter and ordered my usual black coffee. Diane nodded toward the students. "They've been at it all day. Nobody's telling them anything useful." "Good," I said. The bearded guy noticed me watching and headed over. His name tag read, "Jason, Director." "Hi there," he said, sliding onto the stool next to mine. "I'm Jason Wells. My crew and I are making a documentary about small towns with unusual folklore. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" I sized him up. Maybe 22, with the confident look of someone who thought he understood the world. The kind of confidence that got you killed in Millbrook. "I'm Thomas Hartwell. I own the hardware store." "Great to meet you, Thomas. So, what can you tell me about these rules everyone follows around here?" I took a sip of coffee. "They keep people safe." "Safe from what exactly? You got the welcome packet, right?" He nodded, his smile widening. "Oh yeah, that's actually what got us interested. Never pick up hitchhikers on Route 9. Don't enter the old cemetery after dark. Some fascinating local superstitions. We're trying to understand their cultural origins." "They're not superstitions," I said. "They're rules for survival." Jason laughed. "Right, sure. But what are people afraid will happen? That's what we're trying to document, how these beliefs affect small-town dynamics." I thought about Jake Mitchell's abandoned car, about Emma's white jacket lying on the forest floor, about the dozens of others who disappeared over the years because they didn't believe. "People who break the rules disappear?" I said simply. "Disappear how? Like they leave town?" "No, they're taken." The smile remained on his face, but his eyes showed he thought I was putting him on. Taken by what? I finished my coffee and stood up. Follow the rules while you're here, all of them. We're actually planning to film at the cemetery tonight, he said. The lighting should be perfect around midnight. Want to come along and show us around? I looked at him for a long moment. The cemetery after dark is off limits. It's just a cemetery, he said, shrugging. We'll be respectful. I left without answering. There was no point. I'd seen his type before, convinced that local beliefs were just superstition, that the rules didn't apply to them. They wouldn't understand until it was too late, and by then it wouldn't matter. The next morning, I saw their rental car parked along Route 9 as I drove to the store. They had set up cameras on tripods aimed at the road. The girl with purple hair held a large microphone while Jason stood in front of the camera talking animatedly. I pulled over and got out. What are you doing? The fourth student, a skinny guy operating the camera, looked up. B-roll footage for our documentary. We're recreating the hitchhiker legend. This isn't a legend, I said. It's a rule. You shouldn't be out here. Jason came over, looking pleased with himself. Thomas, right? Don't worry, we're not actually picking anyone up. We're just staging some shots. Then I saw that the fourth student, a blonde girl I hadn't spoken to yet, was standing further down the road with her thumb out, pretending to hitchhike while the camera rolled. Get her off the road, I said sharply. It's just for the shot, Jason said. We'll edit in effects later to make it creepy. I walked back to my truck. They wouldn't listen, and I couldn't make them. As I drove away, I saw a dark sedan slow down near their filming location. The blonde girl was still standing with her thumb out. That evening, Sheriff Morrison stopped by the hardware store as I was closing up. Those students rented equipment from you? He asked. I shook my head. Brought their own. Everything okay? Got a call from Bill out at the gas station. Said he saw them filming inside the cemetery an hour ago. Told them about the rules, but they laughed it off. They were out on Route 9 this morning too, I said, setting up hitchhiker reenactments. Morrison sighed heavily. I'll talk to them. Not that it'll do much good if they're determined to break the rules. Where's Deputy Reynolds? I asked, noticing Morrison was alone. Responding to calls about voices in the woods behind Maple Street. Third night in a row. I locked the store and walked home. Dark clouds gathered overhead, unusual for what had been a clear day. The air felt wrong, heavy and still like before a lightning strike. On my porch, I paused to look down the street toward the diner. The students' rental car was parked outside, but they weren't around. Probably still at the cemetery, getting their nighttime footage. I ate dinner alone and tried to read, but couldn't concentrate. Around 10 o'clock, I looked out my window and saw the students walking back toward the diner, cameras and equipment in hand, laughing and talking loudly in the quiet street. The blonde girl wasn't with them. The next morning brought rain, a steady gray downpour that kept customers away from the store. During a break in the weather, I walked to the diner for lunch. Only 3 students sat at their usual booth, surrounded by equipment. Where's your friend? I asked, stopping by their table. Purple hair looked up. Lisa. She got called home for a family emergency. Left early this morning on the bus. Jason nodded, not meeting my eyes. Yeah, real sudden thing. I didn't believe them. The roads out of Millbrook had been closed due to flooding from the rain. No buses had run. But I said nothing and took my usual seat at the counter. Diane leaned close when she brought my sandwich. They left all their windows open last night, during a rainstorm. Found puddles all over the floor this morning. They're breaking all the rules, I said quietly. 3 of them came in for breakfast. Said the 4th took the bus out. There weren't any buses. Diane's lips thinned. I know. That afternoon, the remaining students drove out to Porter's Lake with their cameras. I watched from my truck as they set up equipment near the water's edge. They were filming exactly where the lights appeared on foggy nights. Lights that looked like lanterns but weren't. Lights that moved in patterns that drew people into the water. By evening, word had spread through town that the blonde student was missing. Sheriff Morrison took statements from her friends, who stuck to their story about a family emergency. He called the bus company and confirmed what we already knew. No buses had left Millbrook that day. I watched from my porch as Morrison left the diner. He stopped by my house on his way back to the station. "They're lying," he said, not bothering with greetings. "Girl's been gone since last night. They claim she left on her own, but her wallet and phone are still in her room. What are you going to do?" "Filed a missing persons report. Not that it'll help." He looked tired, older than his 55 years. "They went back to the cemetery tonight. Reynolds tried to stop them, but they said they had a right to be there." "Any word on what happened to the blonde girl?" I asked. "Nothing concrete. Jason admitted they picked up someone on Route 9 yesterday as part of their documentary. Said the person got out near the town line and walked into the woods." Morrison shook his head. "Not a hitchhiker. Something pretending to be one." The sky darkened earlier than usual that night. I double-checked my locks and closed all curtains, standard procedure in Millbrook. Around 9:30, I heard car doors slam outside the diner. Looking through a gap in the curtains, I saw the 3 remaining students loading equipment into their rental car, moving with the frantic energy of people who had seen something they couldn't explain. They drove away fast, tires squealing on wet pavement. I thought they were leaving town for good, but an hour later I saw their car parked back at the diner. The lights in their rooms came on one by one. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the emergency siren started wailing. The sound cut through the quiet night. The town's warning system that hadn't been used since old Mayor Collins disappeared 10 years ago. I moved away from windows, checked all locks again, and sat in my living room with lights off, listening to the sirens rise and fall. 20 minutes it wailed, while I heard things moving outside. Not footsteps exactly, but a sliding, dragging sound that circled my house and tested doors and windows. The siren finally stopped, but the noises continued for hours. I stayed awake all night, sitting motionless in the dark. Dawn broke with unusual stillness. No birds sang, no early traffic moved on Main Street. I waited until full daylight before opening my door. Everything looked normal at first glance. The street, the houses, the storefronts all in their places, but the air felt wrong, like the town was holding its breath. I walked toward the diner, where the student's rental car still sat parked outside. Diane stood in the doorway of the diner, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "They're gone," she said when I approached. "All of them." "What happened?" "I don't know. Their rooms are empty, beds not slept in. All their equipment gone, even the stuff they left charging at the outlets." She nodded toward the rental car. "Keys were on the counter with cash for their bill." Sheriff Morrison arrived with Deputy Reynolds. They took statements from everyone at the diner, then went upstairs to check the rooms. I followed, wanting to see for myself. 3 rooms, all meticulously clean. No luggage, no personal items, no sign that anyone had stayed there except for the neatly made beds. Not even a stray receipt or forgotten phone charger. "Like they were never here," Reynolds said. Morrison ran a hand over his face. "I'll file the reports. Call their university. Won't make any difference." He was right. The students would never be found, just like Jake and Emma Mitchell, just like all the others who'd broken the rules over the years. We went downstairs where a small crowd of locals had gathered. No one asked questions. Everyone understood what had happened. In Millbrook, breaking the rules had consequences, whether you believed in them or not. The rental car company sent someone 2 days later to retrieve the vehicle. Sheriff Morrison's missing persons reports disappeared into databases where they would remain unsolved. No investigators came to town. No news crews covered the story. The world outside Millbrook didn't care about 4 more missing students. I went back to my routine, running the hardware store, locking my doors at night, following the rules that kept me alive. But I thought often about those students with their cameras and confidence, treating our town's dangers like entertainment. How quickly they disappeared, leaving nothing behind but a rental car and empty rooms. They had mocked our rules, filmed our cemetery at night, opened their windows to the darkness, and picked up things pretending to be hitchhikers on Route 9. They'd broken every rule we lived by, and like everyone who did that in Millbrook, they were gone. I stared at the deep gouges in my front door the morning after the students disappeared. 4 parallel lines carved into the wood, spaced about as wide as a human hand, but no human could have made marks that deep. The scratches hadn't been there when I'd checked my locks before sitting in darkness all night. Walking down Main Street, I noticed similar marks on other buildings. The bank's front columns bore scrapes that looked like something had climbed them. The post office windows had handprints smeared across the glass. Normal-looking handprints except for the extra joint in each finger. A week had passed since the film students vanished, and Millbrook felt wrong in ways I'd never experienced before. The town had always harbored its secrets, but they typically remained in their domains. The hitchhikers stayed on Route 9, the voices kept to the woods, the lights confined themselves to Porter's Lake. Now the boundaries were breaking down. "They're getting bolder," Bill Jenkins said when I stopped at his gas station. He pointed to his back wall where a symbol had been carved overnight. A circle with lines radiating outward like a child's drawing of the sun, except the lines bent at unnatural angles. "Found 3 more like it around the property." "Same at my place," I told him, "and all down Main Street." Bill's eyes darted toward the road. 2 more hitchhikers out there this morning. Middle of the day. Never seen that before. I hadn't either. The hitchhikers usually appeared at dusk or dawn, when light played tricks on the eyes. Never in broad daylight. That afternoon I drove out to the cemetery. The old wrought iron gate hung open, which was unusual. We kept it locked even during daylight hours. As I walked through the rows of headstones, I noticed disturbed ground everywhere. Several markers had been knocked over, and fresh holes gaped between graves, not like someone had dug them with shovels, but as if something had pushed up from below. The oldest section, where gravestones dated back to Millbrook's founding in 1723, looked worse. Every stone had been toppled, and the ground was churned up like a freshly plowed field. Standing there, I felt a certainty that turned my blood cold. Whatever rules had kept the supernatural forces in check had been broken beyond repair. After documenting the damage with my phone camera, I called Sheriff Morrison. "I'm at the cemetery," I said when he answered. "You need to see this." "Can't right now," he replied, his voice tight. "Just got reports of voices calling from the woods behind 3 different houses, middle of the afternoon." "The boundaries are breaking down," I said. "Yeah," Morrison agreed. "I think you're right. Call an emergency town meeting, tonight at 7, school gymnasium." I spent the rest of the afternoon notifying everyone I could find. Millbrook's population had dwindled to 43 residents after the most recent departures. Many lived alone, elderly people whose families had moved away years ago. The younger ones stayed because of family obligations or lack of options. Nobody chose Millbrook as a destination anymore, except tourists looking for folklore or families buying cheap property without understanding what they were getting into. By 7 o'clock, every remaining resident had crowded into the gymnasium. The fear was palpable. These were people who understood the rules, who had survived by following them meticulously for years or decades. If the rules no longer protected us, what hope did we have? Sheriff Morrison and Deputy Reynolds stood at the front of the room. Morrison looked like he hadn't slept in days, his uniform wrinkled and his eyes bloodshot. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying across the anxious room. "As many of you have noticed, we're experiencing an unprecedented level of activity. The rules that have kept us safe are becoming less effective." Mrs. Bentley raised her hand. "My grandson says he saw one of those hitchhikers walking down Elm Street yesterday, right through town. Is that true?" Morrison nodded grimly. "We've had multiple reports of entities leaving their usual territories. The cemetery has been severely disturbed. And the voices from the woods are being heard at all hours, not just at night. "What caused this?" Karen Whitley asked from the back row. "Was it those film students?" "Partially," I said, standing up. "But it started with the Mitchell family. 2 violations in quick succession, then 4 more with the students. 6 major rule violations in less than 2 months." "Thomas is right," Morrison agreed. "We've never had so many breaches in such a short time. It's like they've woken up whatever waits out there, made it hungry for more." The room fell silent as everyone processed this. We'd all lost people over the years, family members, friends, neighbors who didn't follow the rules. But the town had maintained an uneasy balance with its supernatural residents. Now that balance was shattered. "There's something else," Morrison continued, his tone dropping. "I got a call from the State Highway Department today. They're starting improvements on Route 9 next month, widening the road, adding shoulders and guardrails." A murmur of alarm spread through the crowd. "Construction crews," Bill Jenkins said. "Outsiders who don't know the rules." "And more tourists after it's finished," added Diane. "That new article about America's most haunted small towns listed Millbrook, already getting calls at the diner asking about rooms." Morrison held up his hands for quiet. "That's why I called this meeting. We need to decide how to handle this. The state won't cancel the project. I've already tried that angle. So we need a plan for protecting these workers and keeping tourists away." For the next hour, we debated options. Some suggested closing the town completely, barricading roads and turning away all visitors. Others thought we should try to warn the construction crews, give them a modified version of the rules. A few of the oldest residents argued we should all leave, abandon Millbrook to whatever forces controlled it. "We could post guards," Deputy Reynolds suggested. "Have someone watching Route 9 at all times to warn travelers about the hitchhikers. And put up better fencing around the cemetery," Karen added. I listened to the ideas, knowing none would be enough. The entities were growing stronger, bolder. Fence wouldn't stop them. Warnings would be ignored. As the debate continued, I noticed the lights flickering. Just once, at first, then again more persistently. I glanced at Morrison, who had noticed too. His hand moved to his radio. The gymnasium fell silent as everyone felt the change in the air, that wrong stillness that preceded supernatural activity. Then came a sound that made my skin crawl, the emergency siren beginning its slow, mournful wail across town. For a moment, nobody moved. The siren hadn't sounded twice in such a short period in living memory. "Everyone stay calm," Morrison ordered, but his voice betrayed his own fear. "Reynolds, check the gymnasium doors burst open as Mark Sanderson rushed in. "They're on Main Street," he gasped. "Dozens of them, walking through town." We crowded to the windows. From the elevated position of the school, we could see down to Main Street where strange figures moved in formation. They looked human-shaped from a distance, walking upright on 2 legs, but their movements were wrong. Limbs bending at impossible angles, heads rotating too far, bodies gliding more than stepping. "Get away from the windows," Morrison commanded. "Everyone go home. Lock your doors and windows. Stay inside until morning no matter what you hear." The crowd scattered, people running to their vehicles or sprinting down side streets toward their homes. I ran to my truck and drove as fast as I dared, passing 3 figures on the way who turned to watch me with faces that weren't quite faces. I skidded into my driveway and ran inside, locking the door behind me. Following the routine that had kept me alive for 32 years, I checked every lock, closed every curtain, and turned off all lights, except for a single lamp in my living room. Through a crack in the curtains, I watched them pass my house, figures walking with stuttering movements, some crawling along walls like insects, others moving in ways my mind couldn't quite process. They were shaped like people, but wrong in fundamental ways. Proportions slightly off, joints bending backward, faces smooth or distorted. One stopped at my front yard. It resembled a woman in a summer dress, except its arms hung to its knees and its neck stretched too long. It turned toward my house, head tilting at an angle no human could achieve without breaking their spine. I stepped back from the window and sat in my chair, listening as it approached my porch. The steps creaked, the doorknob rattled. Then came the scratching, methodical testing of each potential entrance. The windows shuddered as if something pressed against them. Scratch marks appeared in the paint around the frames. For over an hour they tested my house, every door, window, and even the chimney. I heard them on the roof, moving with a sound like too many legs. Something slid down the chimney, but stopped at the closed flue. The worst was when they began speaking, using voices I recognized. Mrs. Bentley's grandson called my name from the front porch. Diane asked me to let her in because she was hurt. Even Morrison's voice ordered me to open up in his official tone. I sat motionless, knowing these weren't my neighbors, but things wearing their voices like ill-fitting clothes. Throughout it all, the siren continued its lonely wail, rising and falling across the town. I wondered if anyone had broken, opened a door, answered a familiar voice, looked too long at something they shouldn't have seen. Each of us sat alone in our houses, following the rules that had kept us alive while something hungry tested our resolve. As the night deepened, I heard a new sound beneath the siren and the scratching. A low, rhythmic chanting from multiple voices coming from the direction of the cemetery. The language wasn't English or any human tongue I recognized. It rose and fell like the siren, almost mimicking it, as if the entities were conducting their own emergency response. Eventually, the pressure against my windows eased, the scratching stopped. The voices moved away, continuing their procession through town. I remained in my chair, awake and alert as I had the night the students disappeared. Outside, the entities continued moving through Millbrook until dawn broke and the siren finally fell silent. I waited until the first light of morning turned my living room gray before moving from my chair. My joints ached from sitting motionless through the night. Outside, birds had started their normal calls, which seemed both reassuring and wrong after what had passed through our town. After checking that the street looked clear, I unlocked my door and stepped onto my porch. The morning air felt clean and normal, but evidence of the night's visitors remained everywhere. Fresh scratch marks ran down my door frame in sets of 4, not quite like animal claws, not quite like human fingernails. Something in between. My front walkway bore odd indentations that reminded me of hoof prints, except they formed a 2-legged walking pattern. Near my mailbox, I found a small carving in the wooden post, the same circular pattern with bent rays that Bill had described at his gas station. Main Street looked worse. I drove slowly, taking stock of the damage. Every storefront showed signs of tampering. The bank's glass doors were webbed with cracks that formed another circular pattern. The post office windows were covered with handprints, hundreds of them in different sizes, some looking almost childlike while others were stretched and elongated with extra fingers. Outside the grocery store, I found Mrs. Bentley sweeping up broken glass. Her hands shook as she worked. "They got inside," she said when I approached. "First time in 30 years. Got through the back door somehow." "Anyone hurt?" I asked. She shook her head. "Nothing taken either, just rearranged everything. All the canned goods stacked in towers. Cereal boxes arranged by color, like children playing." I helped her clean up, then continued my survey of the town. At the school, every window on the ground floor had been broken. The playground equipment had been twisted into shapes that made no sense. Swings wrapped around jungle gyms, slides bent into loops. By noon, I'd documented most of the damage with my phone camera. Some houses remained untouched, while others showed extensive signs of tampering. No one reported injuries or missing persons, which seemed like our only piece of good luck. The town council called an emergency meeting for 2 o'clock at the fire station, since the school gymnasium was unusable. I arrived early to find almost everyone already gathered, talking in low, nervous voices about what they'd experienced. Mayor Wilson called the meeting to order. At 73, he was one of the oldest residents and had lived through more supernatural events than most. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged his notes. "Last night was unprecedented," he began. "I've lived in Millbrook my entire life, and I've never seen the entities move through town like that. Sheriff Morrison has compiled a list of damages." Morrison stood up, looking even more exhausted than yesterday. 40 buildings showed signs of tampering. Every public building was targeted. 12 private homes were breached, though no residents report direct contact with the entities. They seemed more interested in marking territory. "They're claiming the town," Karen Whitley said from her seat near the back, "making it theirs." No one argued with her assessment. We'd all felt it. The night had been a demonstration, a show of force. "Before we discuss next steps," Mayor Wilson continued, 3 families have announcements. The Jenkins family stood first. Bill, his wife Laura, and their teenage son. "We're leaving," Bill said simply. "Packing up tonight, staying with Laura's sister in Boston until we find somewhere new." The Petersons and the Carlsons also announced their departures. All 3 families had children, which made their decision understandable. No one blamed them. "That brings our population down to 34, Morrison noted, making a mark in his notebook. Mayor Wilson looked around the room. "Now we need to discuss how to handle the immediate threats. The Highway Department still plans to start construction on Route 9 next month. Tourism season starts in 2 weeks, and the entities are clearly more active than ever." "We need patrols," Deputy Reynolds suggested. "Regular routes to monitor activity and warn travelers." "With what manpower?" Morrison asked. "I've got myself and Reynolds. That's it for law enforcement." I stood up. "I'll patrol Route 9, I said. "Watch for hitchhikers. Warn any travelers." The room went quiet. Volunteering for patrol duty meant putting myself at risk. The hitchhikers couldn't hurt you if you didn't pick them up, but being near them was still dangerous. They'd been known to follow vehicles, to appear in rearview mirrors even after you passed them. "You sure about that, Thomas?" Morrison asked. "I've lived here 32 years, I said. Never broken a rule, never had direct contact. I know what to look for, and I know how to stay safe." Mayor Wilson nodded. "We'll need more volunteers for other areas. The cemetery needs regular checks. So does Porter's Lake." By the end of the meeting, we had a patrol schedule. Morrison and Reynolds would handle emergency responses. The rest of us would take shifts monitoring problem areas. We also agreed to post new signs at town entrances warning about dangerous road conditions on Route 9 and unsafe structures at the cemetery. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all we had. The entities wouldn't leave. They'd been in Millbrook since its founding. All we could do was adapt and try to minimize casualties. That evening, after checking my house was secure for the night, in case I returned after dark, I climbed into my truck for my first patrol of Route 9. I brought supplies: flashlight, radio, thermos of coffee, sandwich. I wore my heaviest work boots and thick canvas jacket even though the evening was mild. Extra layers made me feel safer. Route 9 stretched 12 miles through our county, with Millbrook at its center. Most hitchhiker sightings occurred at the town limits or along the most isolated stretches. I planned to drive the entire length, watching for the telltale signs of entities posing as travelers. The sun hung low as I turned onto the highway, painting everything orange. Traffic was light. A few locals heading home, a delivery truck passing through. Normal for a weekday evening. I drove slowly, scanning both shoulders of the road. 3 miles past the west town limit, I spotted my first hitchhiker. From a distance, it looked like a young man in jeans and a red flannel shirt, thumb extended. As I got closer, I noticed the wrong details: the slightly too long arms, the way its head moved too smoothly when tracking my approach. I slowed but didn't stop, keeping a good 20 feet between my truck and the figure. Through my open window, I called out to the empty road. "Highway's closed ahead. Construction work. No through traffic." The words didn't matter. What mattered was warning any real travelers who might be approaching from behind me. The hitchhiker entity tilted its head at an unnatural angle, watching me with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. I continued past without making eye contact, then checked my mirrors. The figure remained in place, thumb still extended. A quarter-mile down the road, I turned around and made another pass, calling the same warning. This time, the entity had moved to the other side of the road, now facing east. For 2 hours, I patrolled that stretch, warning imaginary travelers. The entity eventually walked into the woods and disappeared. I counted it as a success. No real drivers had stopped while I was watching. Near the eastern town limit, I found another hitchhiker. This one took the form of an elderly woman with a small suitcase. She looked harmless, the kind of person anyone would feel safe picking up, but her feet didn't quite touch the ground, hovering an inch above the asphalt. I performed the same routine. Slow approach, warning called out, careful observation. This entity was more persistent, actually stepping toward my truck as I passed. In my rearview mirror, I saw it watching me with a face that seemed to blur around the edges. After my third pass, I saw headlights approaching from the east, a real car with real people inside. I positioned my truck in the middle of the road and turned on my hazard lights, forcing the approaching vehicle to slow down. It was a minivan with out-of-state plates. The driver rolled down his window, looking annoyed. "Road's washed out ahead," I lied. "Flash flooding took out the bridge. You'll need to take the county road detour." He looked skeptical, but took the directions I offered for the longer route that bypassed Route 9 entirely. As he made a U-turn, I glanced back to where the hitchhiker had been standing. It was gone. By the time darkness fell completely, I'd intercepted 3 more vehicles and convinced them all to take alternate routes. The hitchhiker entities had moved deeper into the woods, perhaps sensing they wouldn't find victims tonight. As I drove back into town, I felt a small sense of accomplishment. No one had been taken on my watch. It was a small victory, but in Millbrook, staying alive counted as winning. I parked in front of my house and sat for a moment looking at the darkened windows of my neighbors. Some had already left. Others would follow after last night's display. Those who remained would adapt, as Millbrook residents always had. The supernatural forces would always threaten our town. They were part of it, perhaps the most fundamental part. But we had the rules, and as long as we followed them and kept unknowing outsiders away, we could survive. I stepped out of my truck and hurried inside, locking the door behind me before full darkness settled. Through my window, I could see shapes beginning to move between houses, drawn by the night. But I was safe inside, protected by the rules I'd followed all my life. I stepped inside my house and immediately went through my security routine: deadbolt, chain lock, sliding bolt. I checked the windows next, making sure each latch was secure before pulling the curtains tight. The routine was so ingrained after 32 years that my hands moved automatically, finding each lock without needing to look. I moved to the kitchen and poured the remaining coffee from my thermos into a mug, then heated it in the microwave. While I waited, I leaned against the counter and looked around my home. The walls were lined with bookshelves, history books mostly, some fiction, and several journals filled with my own handwritten accounts of Millbrook's supernatural incidents going back decades. My father had kept similar records before me. He taught me the rules when I was 8 years old, drilling them into me until they became second nature. 6 simple rules that kept you alive in Millbrook. Never pick up hitchhikers on Route 9. Don't enter the old cemetery after dark. Keep windows closed at night. Don't acknowledge voices calling from the woods. Stay away from the lights on Porter's Lake. Never follow a figure that appears at the edge of your property. Most Millbrook natives had them memorized by kindergarten. It was the newcomers who suffered, the ones who laughed off the warnings or thought the rules were quaint small-town superstitions. The microwave beeped. I took out my coffee and carried it to the living room, settling into my chair facing the front window. Through a small gap in the curtains, I could see the street outside. The sun had nearly set, painting the horizon with red and gold. Soon it would be full dark. I thought about the town meeting earlier. 3 more families leaving meant we'd be down to 34 residents. How many would remain by summer's end? 10? 5? Would I be the last one someday, alone in a town controlled by entities no one understood? Mayor Wilson and Sheriff Morrison had agreed with my suggestion about posting warning signs. Road closed. Due to construction, signs would go up at both ends of Route 9 by tomorrow, though we all knew determined drivers would ignore them. The mayor had also drafted letters to the State Highway Department citing environmental concerns with the proposed road work, anything to delay construction. My responsibility would be the patrols. 3 nights a week, I'd drive Route 9 watching for hitchhikers and warning travelers. Others had volunteered too. Bill Jenkins would check the cemetery daily until his family moved away. Karen Whitley would monitor Porter's Lake. Deputy Reynolds would patrol the wood's edge, especially near houses where children lived. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all we had. The entities wouldn't leave. They'd been in Millbrook since its founding. All we could do was adapt and try to keep people safe. I sipped my coffee and watched darkness settle over the street. In the shadows between houses, I caught movement, shapes sliding along walls, figures walking with that wrong, stuttering gait. They were out again tonight, moving through our town as if it belonged to them. Maybe it did. A street light flickered and went out, then another. The darkness grew thicker as more lights failed down the block. I stayed perfectly still in my chair, watching through the narrow gap in my curtains. My father's voice echoed in my head. "They can sense movement, Tommy. If they come near the house at night, stay still and quiet until they pass." Something tall and thin walked down the middle of the street. From a distance, it resembled a person in a long coat, but its proportions were wrong. Legs too long, arms hanging nearly to the ground. It moved with a swaying motion like a branch in the wind. I thought about the Mitchells, about Jake picking up a hitchhiker on Route 9, about Emma running into the woods when she heard her brother's voice calling. I thought about the 4 film students who had broken every rule and vanished without a trace. The tall figure stopped directly across from my house. It turned slowly, facing my window. Though I couldn't see its features clearly in the darkness, I felt its attention focus on my home, looking for a way in, looking for me. I remained motionless, barely breathing. The curtain gap was tiny, less than an inch, but I knew these entities could sense life. They were drawn to it like moths to a flame. For several minutes, the figure stood watching my house. Then it raised one too long arm and made a gesture I'd never seen before, fingers spreading and then curling inward like closing flower petals. A voice drifted through the night. "Thomas." It sounded exactly like Sheriff Morrison. "Thomas, I need your help out here." I didn't respond. Rule 4. Don't acknowledge voices calling from the woods or anywhere outside after dark. The voice wasn't Morrison's, just like the figure wasn't human. "Thomas, please." Now it sounded like Karen Whitley. "My car broke down. I just need to use your phone." I took another sip of coffee, keeping my eyes fixed on the figure. These entities had gotten better at mimicry over the years. They used to make small mistakes, calling out names of people who had already disappeared or using voices that didn't match their appearances. Now they were more convincing, more strategic. The figure lowered its arm and turned away, continuing down the street. Other shapes moved in the darkness, some walking, some crawling along the sides of buildings. I counted 12 distinct entities passing by my house over the next hour. Around 9 o'clock, I heard a new sound. Singing. A child's voice, sweet and clear, singing a lullaby from somewhere near my backyard. I recognized the song as one my mother used to sing to me. How did they know that? I didn't look toward the sound. Instead, I closed the curtain completely and moved away from the window. In the kitchen, I made a sandwich and ate it standing up, listening to the singing grow louder, then softer, as if the source was circling my house. After eating, I checked all the locks again, another part of my nightly routine. Everything remained secure. I turned off most of the lights, leaving just one lamp on in the living room. Too much darkness invited them in somehow, but too much light attracted their attention. Another unwritten rule we'd learned through experience. I settled back in my chair with a book about local history, though I wasn't really reading. My mind kept returning to the patrol schedule, to the families who were leaving, to the marks appearing all over town. The entities were becoming more active, more aggressive. The old balance was shifting. Around midnight, the sounds outside changed. The singing stopped. The movement between houses ceased. A strange quiet fell over Millbrook, broken only by a low, rhythmic chanting from the direction of the cemetery. The same chanting I'd heard the previous night. I couldn't make out words, but the sound had a pattern to it. 3 short phrases followed by a longer one, repeated over and over. It reminded me of church services, of call and response prayers. Were the entities performing some kind of ritual? The chanting continued for about 20 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt even more unnatural. No crickets, no distant traffic, no wind in the trees. Nothing. I glanced at the clock. 12:47 a.m. Exactly the same time the chanting had stopped last night. The precision was unnerving, as if these entities operated on a schedule we couldn't comprehend. I considered calling Morrison to report what I'd heard, but decided it could wait until morning. Using the phone after dark sometimes attracted their attention. Not an official rule, but a precaution many of us took. Instead, I settled deeper into my chair for the long night ahead. I wouldn't sleep. Not with them active outside. I'd stay awake and alert until dawn, just as I had the night before. This was life in Millbrook now. Patrols during daylight, vigilance after dark, following the rules that kept us alive. The entities had always been here, but they were changing, becoming bolder. Our town was changing too, shrinking as more residents fled. But I would stay. This was my home, the place my family had lived for generations. Someone needed to patrol Route 9, to warn travelers about the hitchhikers, to remember the rules that protected us. Someone needed to document what was happening here, to keep the records just as my father had. Outside, I heard footsteps on my front porch, the heavy tread of work boots. A faint tapping came at my door, almost polite. "Thomas," a voice called softly. Bill Jenkins this time. "You still up? Need to talk to you about something." I didn't answer. Bill lived 3 streets over. The real Bill would never visit after dark, would never break the rules. Whatever stood on my porch wasn't my friend. The tapping came again, more insistent. Then the doorknob rattled. The deadbolt held. For nearly an hour, the thing pretending to be Bill Jenkins tried to convince me to open the door. Its voice grew increasingly desperate, then angry, then pleading. Eventually, it gave up and moved away. More shapes passed by my windows as the night progressed. Some paused to press hands or faces against the glass. Others scratched at the siding or roof. None found a way in. I remained in my chair, watching and waiting as I had so many nights before. I thought about the town meeting, about the patrol schedule, about the 6 rules that kept us alive. I thought about the families who had already left and those who would follow soon. Millbrook would never be completely safe, but I had found a way to help protect the remaining residents. My patrols would intercept supernatural entities before they could harm travelers. The town council would discourage tourism and keep construction crews away from residential areas. Those of us who stayed would adapt, as Millbrook residents always had. As the hours passed, I heard voices calling from the woods behind my house. familiar voices of people long gone, of neighbors who had disappeared years ago. I saw shapes moving past my windows, testing doors and scratching at walls, but I stayed inside where the rules protected me from the dangers that controlled my hometown.